Okay, I welcome you all to day 2 of the Nordic Summer School 2021. Today is day 2 of the lecture series. Just a few instructions for all participants. Firstly, we request you all to keep your mics on mute so we can hear the speaker clearly. Secondly, we'll be circulating a Google form, which will be your attendance and feedback form for day 2. We request you, you will find the form in the chat, and we request you to fill it and send it by 5 p.m. tomorrow evening. Thirdly, the questions for the speaker will be after. We request you to address all questions and type them in the chat. We will take note of all questions, and based on the time that is left at the end, we will be addressing the questions to the speaker. Now, now it's time for the first lecture of day 2. The first lecture will be on industrial development in Norway by Professor Hans Christian. Professor Christian is Professor of Work-Life Research at Department of Working Life and Innovation, School of Business and Law at the University of Adger, Norway. He has a background in economics and political science. He has published extensively in the field of innovation and work-life research. His latest edited book is Coping with the Future, Rethinking Assumptions for Society, Business and Work. I now invite Professor Sarkar to welcome Professor Hans Christian, and then we can move on to the lecture.
Thank you, Yash. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Nordic Summer School. I hope you have enjoyed your first day. We did receive the feedback form. Some of you have taken care to fill it. Others have been pretty casual, I would say. I mean, I was looking for something more substantial than great, nice, and interesting. So maybe for the next, lot, you'll give us some more feedback about the lectures. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Hans Christian from Adger University to this lecture today. He is going to speak to us about the industrial relations in Norway. I think it is extremely important given the way we had discussed in the inaugural session and also subsequently about how the Nordics are a model. And when we talk about the Nordics as a model, we focus on various parameters of its development. And we know that these are very well-developed societies, countries in terms of economic development, in terms of living standards, and most importantly, in terms of inclusive development. So when we talk about industrial development, I think it would be important to see how they have negotiated relations between employers and the employees. So how do you create that inclusiveness? How do you create happiness? Because we also heard about how these countries are also very high on the happiness index. So I think we need to know how they have managed these industrial relations. And this is what Professor Christian is going to talk to us today. And I think we will be able to know what are the specificities of this model, specifically also related to the fact that they have very, good institutional arrangements through which negotiations and bargains and compromise are a part of those institutional arrangements through which such compromises are made. So I think Professor Christian is going to be the best person to tell us about this. Over to you, Professor Christian. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for being part of this very exciting program. I have a lot to say, so if I can share screen, I will simply start talking. Can you see my screen now? If somebody is nodding, yeah, okay.
Yes, we can.
And now I'll try to show that. Yeah. So let me just go straight on to the topic. I will be talking about industrial relations, but it's also a kind of historical background for what you will be talking about later about the Norwegian or the Nordic model. I use Norway because I know that more extensively, but the Norwegian story has a parallel in Denmark and Sweden. There are differences. Even Sweden had an industrialization that happened a little earlier than Norway in the 1900, late 1900. Finland, for instance, had some more conflict in the beginning of the 20th century with their civil war and so on. So there are historical differences between the countries, but some of the features of what I will be saying are the same, and it comes out in the end, let's say over the last two generations, as more or less the same kind of model that this will lead up to. But I will take a historical perspective, a longitude historical perspective, and I will use this idea of that industrial development has happened over 4 stages. You know that from the discussion now of Industry 4.0 and so on. And I will use that scheme as a way of trying to sort of argue how this relationship and then the social model that has come out of this relationship has happened in Norway. That's why I also gave you a video that just introduced those 4 stages. If you have seen it, then you will follow my logic. Otherwise, you can have a look at it later on. So the idea here is that work has changed, industry has changed. It's basically because technology has changed, but it's not argument here is not a kind of technological determinism. It's more to say that there are changes in production forms, work forms, and social forms and social structures that happen in a way that are in a way coordinated, or in a way they happen. And that creates the kind of environment that society has had to deal with. And the first industrial revolution then changed the environment from the pre-industrial society based on crafts, based on manual labor and so on, into industry. And when industry was introduced, we moved away from being dependent on nature. We tried to have more control over nature. We were more dependent on the clock than we're dependent on the seasons and so on. And the big discussion, which I think is relevant for what I will be saying, is that if we go back to Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations, where that the first, let's say, theoretical discussion of the kind of changes that industrialization would imply, he based his theory on the spinning jenny that was introduced some 50 years before he wrote, and he saw that the implication of that industrialization would have tremendous effect on society. And he proposed that one of the main effects will be a humanization of society, in the sense that unskilled work would now disappear because machines will do the hard work that people were formerly doing. And then there will be room for more skilled work, more and so on following that. But Adam Smith, of course, he wrote even before the steam engine was actually in function, more or less. It came, the first successful use of steam or test of the steam engine happened more or less at the same year that he published his work. So he didn't see how he might have thought he exaggerated what the spinning jenny could do, but he didn't see what tremendous power this industrial revolution would have. And then when Karl Marx wrote about this 2 generations later, one of the disagreements with Adam Smith was that he said that no, this industrialization doesn't remove unskilled work, and rather it creates a large labor class, unskilled labor class. And the difference here is, of course, that Marx could see what has actually happened. He could observe what kind of factories we had got and what social structure that had developed over those 60, 70 years that had gone since Adam Smith was writing. And at that time, in the middle of the 19th century, the realization that industrialization and capitalism could have these effects also inspired other lots of discussions, of course, not only the Marxian discussion, but also a discussion about, can we curb this in a way? Can utopian capitalism was a way of curbing some of these effects, and say that we don't want this negative effect of industrialization. We want to compensate somehow for this. but this utopianism and so on didn't seem to be strong enough to cover the kind of structural development that this industrialization was creating. And then with the technological changes that happens around 1880 with steam engine, with the combustion engine, with electricity and so on, there is an upscaling of industrialization into what we could call mass production, that even makes these earlier effects even more apparent, and even Marx and Engels' reflection on the impact of industrialization seemed to be too mild if you compare it to what happens then between 1880 and the early 20th century. So and here now we see that the structure, the social structures, and the divide in the social structures between a labor class, a growing bourgeoisie, or a middle class, and so on. These divisions become stronger, and also you could say that to put it a little bit on the extreme, we say that this upscaling of production also implied a kind of downgrading of work that created even larger problems. And this is where the Norwegian story enters, so to speak, because at this stage, Norway is also starting to get production, industry, large production units, and labor issues. And the first issues comes up with some strikes in the 1880s. And at this time, politics and so on are not aware of these changes. They have not had the focus. It's not part. There is no labor policy or industrial policy or anything like that at this time. But because of these strikes, and because people become aware of the social and humanistic impact of the industry, Norway puts down what is called a labor commission. The parliament puts down a labor commission in 1885, which is sort of the first time that the political system starts to intervene and engage in this sort of development. And at the same time, we start to get unions in Norway, and in the late 1800s, we get the Norwegian Labor Union that organize all the unions and so on. So the institutional structure is then developed as a response to this growing industrialization that happens very fast between 1880 and the beginning of 1900. And the point is that these labor commissions from the 1885 try to track and monitor the development in industry and so on, but they recognize at a certain point that and they report to the parliament, and parliament to consider measures and so on to cope with these things, but there is no policy on the one hand, and at the same time what's happening out in society escalates in terms of conflict and so on. And at a certain point of time, this commission says we cannot work anymore. There is such a hostile environment, and now we are in the 1920s, around 1920, and the conflict level in the Norwegian work life, as in the other Scandinavian countries, and is it actually in Europe as a whole at this point, escalate to a point where the dialogue has broken down. So the key thing, I think, for understanding the Scandinavian or the Nordic development is that in different from what happening in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, in many Eastern European countries and so on, even in France and so on, there is a willingness, there is some kind of process, social willingness. We can speculate on this, But it seems to be that at one point of time, instead of moving into open conflict, people come together and say, we have to solve this. We have to we cannot continue with this kind of hostile conflict environment. It's destructive for society, it's destructive for everybody. So there is an agreement of a work peace committee that is put down in a dialogue between employees, representatives, union, confederation of industry, and politics, and in order to say how can we solve this. And this work and this coming together and say we cannot have a society being split, to be destroyed by these kind of conflicts, lead to what is called a basic agreement in 1935. And it's interesting that the same kind of agreement is made in Sweden and Denmark at the same time. So this is not a coincidence. It's not a special Norway thing. It's a phenomena, you could say, that a problem that has emerged and a willingness, a common willingness in how to solve this. Of course, people had seen what had happened in Spain, in other European countries that had led to civil war and other things. So there was a willingness to say, we need to come together, otherwise this same thing will happen with us. And here you can see that even if this agreement was between the social partners, the dialogue with politics and the political system was there at the same time. So at the same time that the social partners made their basic agreement, the politicians established a labor protection law that coincide, you could say, that supplemented this basic agreement, and then you had created the basic for this tripartite system that is the cornerstone of the Norwegian and Nordic, and you now could say Scandinavian model. And then what happens further on is much more, this is the foundation, and without that, the rest of the story wouldn't be like it was. But there is an addition to this when we are at the other end of the other side of the Second World War, and that is that not only was it important to have a kind of structural arrangement in work life and a peaceful relationship in work life, but there is also a political willingness to have an industrial policy where you can develop industry further. Norway was at this time in 1945 a rather poor country, and we need to improve our production, our skills, our competencies, and so on. And so there was an initiative, partly in cooperation with the Tavistock Institute in London, in England, on saying how can we improve the workplace and upgrade the workplace. And a key person in this work was a guy called Einar Thorsrud, together with Fred Emery, which is also a key person. I won't go into this, but it's interesting that Einar Thorsrud, he was a human resource manager in a big industry in Norway called Freia, which was producing chocolate. And Freia was the leader of this factory, was also a kind of utopian capitalist. This is the canteen, the labor canteen, built in the 30s in this factory. And you see it's decorated by the famous Norwegian artist, a painter, Edvard Munch, just to say how you appreciate, as a way of saying how you appreciate workers and so on. So this was the kind of mood in which this new initiative was taken. Also, I won't have time to go into this, but there is also a recognition that in order to understand work life, you have to understand both individual needs, which was the human relation between tradition, American human relation tradition was inspired Norwegian development, and but you also have to understand the collective dimension of how groups of people work and understand how it is to be in an organization and so on, and so these insights from the 50s, 60s, and so on melted into this recognition that a good work life is not only dependent on laws, it not only depends on relationship by social partners, it also depends on what is happening on the everyday life in the company, at the shop floor, and so on, and real democracy, real participation, and so on is dependent on all these layers. Now, this anticipates, in a way, the changes that happens globally in the third wave of capitalism, or the third wave of industrialization, what we could call the computer age, and so on, that actually start in the 50s but materialized in the 70s. The transition from mass production to knowledge economy. I won't go into this, but there is a big transition also then in the composition of labor and in the geography of where people work and how they work and so on. So the thing that the discussion that had been in Norway from the Second World War on was, as I say, anticipating to a large extent this kind of new understanding of knowledge workers and the need to engage all employees in a kind of dialogue, democratic dialogue at work. So I'm looking at my clock watch now, just to see that I stay a little bit within the limits I have. So you could say that from this very short, very brief sort of review of the history here, we can say that what came out and has been for the last two generations, perhaps, what they call the Norwegian social model, is then a model that has these regulations at the societal level, the willingness to have a policy that puts up decent rules for work and behavior and so on. At the institutional level, there are these agreements between social partners that also puts up principles for peaceful negotiation. Doesn't mean that people agree. There are lots of conflicts, but these conflicts are now handled civilized and democratically, and not in the kind of hostile way or brutal way, you could say, that we had in the 20s. But I think that's the special thing about the Scandinavian model, perhaps, is that you also have these layers here at the business level. At management level, employees are represented in boards and so on. So there is a need to negotiate, a need to talk together also at this layer, but also at the shop floor level, there is cooperation, there is trust, a kind of trust level, so that you can have employees that are working rather autonomous, because there is this trust level all the way through the system. You don't need to have all the checks, all the order supervision and so on that you might have if you don't trust each other. There is a general understanding all the way through, and recognition by management to trust their employees, by employees to be working in the interest of the company and so on. So this kind of relationship, I think, is important. And then we have the supporting welfare system that handles, is supposed to handle all those things that happens, as all the things that can be handled within work life is handled within work life. For instance, we don't have a minimum wage in Norway because these things are handled within work life. It's not necessary for politicians to intervene, for instance, with minimum wages. But for all the things that cannot, for instance, people that cannot work or other issues, we have the welfare system. So this is the model. So what will happen to this model if we go into Industry 4.0, if we have a new shift in the industrial development, that factories are not the cornerstone of the industrial structure, that full employment, that fixed employment is not the standard model, is no longer a standard model, and so on. What will happen if platform economy or will for instance technology make new divides between those who are skilled and non-skilled and so on? These issues are, we don't know. Some of you might be familiar with this Frey and Osborne analysis that says that 40–50% of all work today will disappear with Industry 4.0 and so on. And lots of countries here from the United States are anxious about what might happen, for instance, if fixed work is no longer the issue and so on. And ELO, Eurofund, others are of course concerned with the same things. We don't know. We don't know what social forms, work forms, and structures that will be coming out in the future, and that's why also this, I think, discussion about the Scandinavian or Norwegian model are aware of these things, and the question is, how should we make the models? If you look at the long-term history, the reason for the problems we had in the 1920s was that politics was behind. It wasn't proactive. It was behind, and it came too late. It came sufficiently quick so that the problems wasn't bigger than they were, but it could have been a catastrophe if they hadn't sort of responded to the situation. Now I think we see that we need to be proactive in order to be aware of where is society going, what work forms, what kind of welfare forms and so on can cope with the kind of future that we might look into. Okay, I think I stop there in order to stick to my timetable, and then I rather take questions and so on if this was meaningful or yeah.
Thank you, Professor Christian, for an illuminating lecture. We will now be moving on to the questions. I will be moderating the chat where we have a few questions, and you can answer them as we go. All right. So the first question is by Mohammad Shafiq. He asks, could you elaborately illustrate the potential power of public employers and the classification of power, I am assuming in the workplace hierarchy, in Nordic region or particularly Norway?
So the role of the public employees.
Yes.
What is the question? What do you think?
What is the potential of public employers in terms of industrial relations and
yeah.
in Norway?
Well, I think that if you think of the discussion around the model, you could say, that we have, the Scandinavian or the Norwegian model, the model has always thought of that it's industry, it's the private industry that is running the economy, and the public sector is supporting the economy. So that has been the basic idea. Of course, public sector is huge, and so that idea might be wrong. It might not coincide, or it might not correspond with reality. But it's still so that when for instance politicians are planning the economy or planning for economic development, it's what's happening in industry that is setting the stage, you could say. And for instance, if you look at, let's say, wage regulations or public wages and so on, they are set at a level that where it's the industry that sets the target, and then the public sector follows, you could say. So it's supposed to be not be the driver in this, but in practice, of course, public sector is so huge that it now counts for a very big share of the economy. So this relationship is perhaps something we haven't figured out really how to handle in the future.
So the next question is by Upasna. She asks, can you talk more about the tripartite balance of the Norwegian model?
Yeah. So as I said, if you compare this to other, let's say, European countries that I know a little bit about, I think it's important to say that there is a kind of formal and a kind of informal dimension in the way that the Scandinavian countries has handled this. The formal part is very similar to what you have seen in other countries. The formal part is that you have a two-party agreement, and then the public sector or the government adds on with certain things in order to make this deal, so to speak, meaningful. And the extent to which the government then is taking part in this two-party arrangement differs a lot. For instance, Germany is very much more closer to the Norwegian and the Scandinavian way of thinking than, for instance, Britain, if you take these differences. But I also think there is an important informal dimension here, and that's why I highlighted this development in the 1920s, and 1930s. I think that I think all European nations know that the worst thing that can happen is a civil war. Anybody has experienced a civil war will know that this is absolutely worst thing that could ever happen. And I think that in Scandinavia there has been enough informal relationships in order to say that, okay, we can disagree, we can have conflict, but we stop there. We stop at a certain level. We don't go that step further into escalating a conflict so that we end in a civil war situation. And I think this informal dimension is present all the time. And you cannot institutionalize that. It's like if there is a conflict, for instance, we have had labor conflicts or work-life conflicts in Norway, hostile conflicts in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. But at one point of time, all parties say, now enough is enough, let's stop this. We have had strikes that have been lasting for months and so on, that has more or less paralyzed society. And so on. So this is, and in this respect, we are not very different from others, but there is a kind of informal threshold, so to speak, that now we stop. Now we don't go the next step. We stop here, and so on. So and concretely, it means that when at a certain point of time, the two parties in a work life can more or less agree on whatever they want, but at a certain point of time, if they don't agree, the government can click in and say, we set the rule, we decide, we are a kind of judge, you could say, in this relationship. So government plays a dual role, because they are on the one hand supporting the agreement, the partners agree on something, and then they say, we can add in something. For instance, we can throw in some money on this or that welfare issue. But at the same time, the government can also be the last resort, in a way, a judge in a way, and say that now is enough, and now we stop the conflict. Now it's the end of the negotiation. This is the rule, and so on. And so this kind of working, I think, is special for the Scandinavian countries, and obviously others as well. but it's quite special for the Scandinavian countries. Sorry for long reply, but yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
We have time. We have two related questions by Rajiv and Sayantan. They ask, how do you see the role of women in Norwegian industrial developments and its transformation? And secondly, how efficient do you think has been the process of ongoing developments in industrial regulations in achieving wage parity between genders?
Yeah, well, if you look at the signature on the 1935 agreement, it's only men. So we of course Norway was a kind of male-dominated society for a long time, but women's rights, we were rather early on women's rights and so on. The political movement for gender equality, I couldn't say that this is something that came out of work life. I think it's much more a political development that happened parallel. And of course, it had a tremendous effect because of this collaborative model and because of this agreement that there should be this equality between genders and so on. This, of course, has had an enormously structuring effect on the wage structure and the social structure and so on. And as I said, I'm not trying to say what the one that caused the other thing and so on. I'm trying to establish kind of parallel things here, and the social form. Of course, you can speculate. So why is this kind of, let's say, gender liberty, where does it come from and so on? And of course, I think knowledge society, higher education, now it's more women in Norway that have a higher education degree in many disciplines than men and so on. And so these changes, of course, has changed the whole nature of this gender balance and made it much more balanced as it is today. But there is also this political willingness, I think, to say that this is how, again, there is a political intervention in work life, but it's also a dialogue. And here you can perhaps see that the political intervention perhaps have played a bigger role than the dialogue.
All right. Okay, so the next question is from Sumbul. She's asking, could you enlighten us on how economic progress in Norway has contributed to democracy building in the country beyond the arena of the workplace?
Yeah, so I think that the discussion about democracy at work, I think it's not like a Nordic invention. Of course, democracy has been strong in Scandinavia, in Norway, when we became an independent country in 1905 and so on. But I also think that for instance, I mentioned this Tavistock Institute that was introduced in Norway to help organize industry and so on, which was also very much inspired by pragmatism, John Dewey, and the idea of democracy at work, democracy at home, sort of democracy in the whole society. So I think there are international ideas that also have flown into Norway at this point, but the thing that John Dewey, for instance, talk about, that when you have democracy at many levels in society, they reaffirm, they support each other, so to speak. I think I wouldn't say that the one is the cause of the other. I think it's the parallel development here has sort of supported the political system, the economic system, and so on, based on democratic principle, has supported each other, so to speak.
All right. Okay. So the next, we also have a couple of participants who want to know about industrialization 4.0. They're asking, what do you see as the impact of industrialization 4.0 on Norway? And what kind of strategic changes has Norway made or plans to make in order to deal with the impact of industrialization 4.0?
Yeah, so this is a big discussion that's going on at the moment, and this is an area where there is a mutual ignorance, you could say, because nobody really knows. Um, um, uh, and yeah, very concretely, there are some expert kind of committees that are looking into these issues at the moment, that are informing government and so on, and see to argue that perhaps we need to do this and that. I think that the main initiative has to do with education. I think that all prognosis indicate that whatever happens, the higher education level you have in society, the better you are prepared for what might happen. But nobody, and if you look at the prognosis, for instance, from Eurofund and others that put out prognosis for the whole of Europe, Norway is not directly, but because we are not part of that, but you can see the other Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, and so on. They are the ones are likely to be the least affected because of their high education level, and because also that we have less of the kind of work that is perhaps the first thing that will be affected by, let's say, digitalization and so on. But also I think that there is the industrial policy in Norway now embraces this possibility, for instance, to reindustrialize Norway as a base because of this technology, because the industrialization now doesn't mean that you need to have a huge labor force. You can now have intelligent robots and machines that can work for you and so on. So there, I think all in all, in Norway, I guess the same thing in the whole of Scandinavia. One looks at Industry 4.0 as a potential and as possibility, and not so much as a threat.
All right. I think we can have one last question. This is by Mriga. He asks, don't you think the Norwegian social model has impacted sustainability? As with a more aging population, the large base of young taxpayers are actually sponsoring the pensions of the old.
Yeah, so first of all, discussion, you know, there is an issue here related to sustainability. If you think of it more generally, and which I didn't talk about, namely how Norway was lucky to find oil, and we have based much of our welfare system on the fact that we have enormous oil reserves that we or reserve from oil that we can use also to support our welfare model. And so the generation conflict between the elder and the younger, and who is to pay for the pensions and so on, hasn't appeared in Norway as such a big issue as it had in many other countries where there is a more direct relationship. It will probably become an issue because we are reducing our dependence on oil, and from environmental reasons we want to reduce or perhaps also close down the whole oil business. Means that these revenues will no longer come, and then we have to cope with these things. But it's very interesting that which indicate the kind of model that we are talking about, that actually already government and social partners have been able to negotiate or renegotiate the conditions for pensions in Norway. Not because we don't have the money at the moment, but because it's supposed that we will not have the money 20 years from now or 30 years from now. And this is interesting, I think, because in many other countries you don't see this until you have to do it when there is no more money. You have to make these arrangements, these adjustments. But here you do it at the time where you actually you have enough resources, but you still understand that unless we make reforms in our pension system, we will not be able to have a sustainable model in the future. So there is has been a kind of pragmatic willingness to make these adjustments already.
All right. Thank you, Professor. I now invite Christabel from Nordic Center India to thank you formally.
Dear Professor Hans, thank you very much for spending your time with us. Thank you very much for agreeing to come and lecture to the students on behalf of both NCI and on behalf of the Center for European Studies at JNU and Professor Bhaswati and team. We thank you sincerely for the time you've spent, for talking about such an important concept and such an important period of history to the students. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
This is scheduled for you guys. Thank you for having me. Yeah, so you're sure you don't do a break or anything? You just go straight on to the next topic? Okay, great to be here. Yes, I prepared some slides that I'd like to show you in a little presentation. We'll try to keep it relatively short so we can use the time to have more of a dialogue, because I am very curious about what you're thinking about these topics. And I look through your schedule and you really have a quite diverse selection of topics over these days covering the Nordics. And this last slot today will be about the environmental issues, presumably from, I would say, I guess you will find it from a little different angle. I'm not a government person, so I'm in academia. So I have, to some extent, the freedom to think and say what I want, which is wonderful. That's the beauty of being an academic and not having to have real responsibility for things. So what I'd like to talk about now is, let's see if it just works here, is a little bit about Nordic environmental leadership ? I think I'll start a little bit with my personal background, because I think that somehow puts you on the right track about where I'm coming from with these questions and concerns I'm having about where we are in the Nordics with regard to environmental and climate policy in particular. So I got my PhD from Lund University, which you might know in South Sweden, one of the biggest universities in Sweden. And after that, I moved to Asia. And I think being in Asia, only for 3-4 years, it gave me a lot of new insights and new perspectives on things, and things that I started working on during my PhD time sort of matured, and I became, to use a popular word, more radicalized through being in Asia and thinking in more radical ways maybe about climate policy, and especially China and what I saw there. And then I returned to Sweden in 2014, and I've been working at Umea University up north of Sweden since then. But to go even further back, I grew up in Kalmar, which is a small town in southeast Sweden, and I kind of unusual upbringing, maybe in the way that all the other kids, they had their cars in the family and all these things, but my parents were very strictly traditional environmentalists. So I grew up very much focusing on what are the virtues of traditional environmentalism, and much of those values. And I know this coming from a development context like India, this is like the upside universe. But you also have this in India, of course, when you have this most post-material values and so forth. So that is my background, and I was very much thinking that the solution to all environmental problems and then what would eventually become climate would be some kind of moral inner reform of people, changing values, or that people should become somehow fundamentally different or more attuned to nature. And if you want a pop cultural reference, I learned from working in Asia that you should never use those, but I dare to do it anyway. It's this movie Avatar, when you can imagine these indigenous people living in harmony with nature, and that kind of imagery was very much with me. I believe that we all had to become green somehow to take better care of the environment. So that is the kind of values, and those are very common in Sweden, especially about the upper middle class kind of values. So what happened a lot for me, this picture to the right is for where I live in Seoul in Korea, one of the days when we had a yellow dust coming in from China. We always like to point out that they come from China, but of course, a lot of it is also domestic pollution coming from car traffic in Seoul with 25 million people. And this developed for me also my visits. I've only been twice to India, but that sort of also reinforced this tension between the right to development and environmental protection, and also seeing the bigger picture of this over time of economic change and technological change. And this has led me to write quite a lot about an issue I call scalability. And that is about to what extent it's about the solutions that we have in Scandinavia, or what we put forth, to what extent are those solutions globally scalable, or to what extent are they dependent on local features? To just give you one immediate example, if you think of Sweden, we have a lot of rivers. It's the same of all Nordic countries, except Denmark. We have a lot of rivers that are usable for hydropower. But if we would use that as our primary way of cutting emissions, that is maybe good for us, but it's very difficult for other countries that don't have those resources to imitate or follow. That is an example of low scalability, just to give you an immediate example. So I've written quite a bit because I think scalability is overlooked in climate policy, because it's much more focused on what, looking at our own country, like what can we do to look green or feel good about ourselves, and much less about how are we to address this question globally in a world where we are 78 billion people, and many of us aspire for a modern lifestyle, and how is that going to be sort of reconciled? And one issue I see a lot, when I have to start here a little bit, just to give you some, how should I say, some framing to this problem of scalability, is that much today when we talk about sustainability in Sweden, for instance, we look at a household. We say, okay, we have our house here. How can I charge my cell phone, or how can I power my home, or have my Tesla car, or whatever? But there is very little discussion about embodied energy and where does all this stuff come from in the first place? How come I have a cell phone or a house? And what energy levels do you need to sustain a modern society? And because of international trade, we are able to displace a lot of this. And as we know, if you go back 40 years or 50 years, we had a lot of shipyard industry, for instance, in Sweden. All of that is now in East Asia, in China and Korea, that outcompeted us. So we don't have to produce as many things. We still have some heavy industry, but we have a lot of imported carbon-intensive goods to Scandinavia. So when you look at these two pictures, you see that there's a complete difference between what you need to power your home and what you need, the energy you need to sustain a whole society, or to build these things, and especially if you have to be responsible for production. And this, of course, becomes particularly interesting if you look at a country rapidly developing like India. And energy is not a small question, and we know, of course, this is also be a big focus on how to bring about electrification and how to bring about more denser fuels and move away from biomass as a primary energy source. And today this is a much bigger discussion, but it's worth just to look a little bit about this, because it's also about the current focus a lot on intermittent renewable energy, which is very popular today with wind and solar. And we often hear these, I guess you read in the newspapers in India as well and everywhere, that renewable is becoming super cheap and it's much cheaper than coal. And you've all heard these kind of headlines and seen them in the media. And that is maybe true if you have a functioning electricity grid and you add on the margin 1 kilowatt hour. Then it is true that solar is very competitive in wind power as well. But when you look at the whole system, how to build an entire electricity grid, and then the picture looks very different, because then you have the problem of intermittency. I mean, the most obvious case of that is called night, that you have right now, that it's dark, and you get this problem over time, that you have to balance the grid and have more electricity backup in different ways. And when you look at these numbers, you really see the big contrast that these new electricity sources that are, everyone is so focused on renewable energy today. When you look at how are you going to balance this and how you're going to power big industries, then it becomes quite a different image. Because this is where I think the Nordic countries are very fortunate that we, as I said, we import a lot of stuff, we don't have to take responsibility for the whole picture. We can only look at our little tiny part. And this, I think, creates a big long-term challenge when it comes to what climate policies should Sweden pursue. And why that is a question is because what I'm worried about in my research is that the better we succeed in a way to decarbonize our economies in very rich and affluent countries with almost no people, the more self-righteous we will become and more happy about it, what we have done. And then we will look to other countries and say, it's now your turn. But it's such a very, very different challenge to decarbonize the Indian economy or the Chinese economy or many other developing countries' economies compared to a country like Sweden. And this is often lost, I think, in the debate. So what I've been doing in my research a lot is to ask myself, what would it take to decarbonize the entire global economy? And if we are serious about doing that, how can a country like Sweden contribute? And that's where I think that I come to a very different conclusion to many more mainstream, let's say, politicians and how the discourse is in Sweden. Because the general view in Sweden is that we should do our part in Sweden and we should reduce our emissions or focus on particular choices here rather than taking this bigger picture about how do we contribute. And I'm really worried about this because I think, especially now after the pandemic, that we're seeing that it's quite easy to reduce a couple of % every year emissions, and we can go down. Even globally, emissions are going up, but in Scandinavia, we can imagine this trend for energy efficient appliances in our homes, better technologies, cars, electrified, small different sectors, small, tiny, slowly, we are decarbonizing, definitely spontaneously, a couple of % maybe per year if we're lucky. But we don't achieve deep decarbonization because we have a core of the economy which is still very, very fossil. And the same is definitely true if you look over time, despite everything you read, and so the share of fossil fuels and coal in the economy has stayed basically the same since 1980. We have not been able, we are at 80%, and that's where we always been more or less. We have a very, very fossil global economy, and that's just reality. And fossil fuels, of course, are great in many ways compared to biomass or what we used to do before, but they also have this big climate impact, which is very difficult to fix if you compare it to, for instance, the ozone layer issue with the CFCs and so, where you could have more technological fix. And I also look, because I'm one of those very crazy people. I know this is used to be the very normal. If you go back to 1950s, this was what every normal person believed. Today, it's a kind of fringe position. But my fringe position is I believe that we could have a world where everyone can live a modern life, and we can have a world where everyone can live, let's say, like the Nordic countries if they want to. I don't believe we should have a world of global apartheid where people are locked into boxes now more than ever with COVID. And then when we have chronic poverty as a kind of solution to climate change. Because whenever you have these discussions about climate change, you get into that window where people say, okay, but if everyone would live like a Swede, it wouldn't work. That is like the basic assumption. That is where most people stop talking. They're like, okay, we can't do that. But I think we should start talking there and say, okay, if that is where we want to go, how should we get there? And that is a very, very different perspective. And I passed along a book chapter which sort of spells this out a little bit for those who are curious. I know many of you might already know this, and you are familiar with this basic, there are many different ways to frame this, but what we can basically say is that in reality, it's going to be extremely difficult to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. And unless you are believing in magic things and stuff, I think it will be very, very hard. And I think we have to be realistic about this. There is, of course, a political discourse and a political process now, especially with Biden trying to renew this. And it's all great that they're doing this. And I think they are on track to do a lot of good things, maybe. But realistically, if we look at it globally, I think we are we are on track for 3 to 4 degrees warming within this century, unless something very different happens. I think that's like the baseline for a reality-based analysis of this. But who knows? We are seeing now, again after COVID, that we have the next biggest hike in emissions ever this year set for. So that's just to give you some context. So we are rapidly running out of this. When you look in Europe, though, and this is very interesting, I don't know if you know this, some countries like Germany are very, very good at exporting the image that they are green, but that's absolutely not the case. Germany has one of the, let's say, mid-level polluter if you looked at electricity in Europe. This is just a day, this snapshot, you can look it over days, but if you look consistently on this map, there are like a number of countries that stand out, and those are France, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. If you look on, to some extent, Switzerland. If you look at this over time, and the reason for this is there are two reasons why we have already decades ago in Scandinavia, I'm jumping a little bit, been able to decarbonize electricity. Electricity is just one part of energy, which many people don't really seem to recognize. There's a broader, of course, you need energy for so many things in society, but electricity is very clean in the Nordics. And the reason for this are two main reasons, and that is that we have hydropower and that we have nuclear power. If you look at those two energy sources, only one, of course, is scalable, and that is nuclear, whereas hydro, it's depending on how many rivers you have. But those countries that have rivers that can be used like this, like Iceland, like Norway, like Costa Rica, they often are treated as climate leaders. But I don't think this is really the case. I mean, it's case maybe for them, but it doesn't really help the world, to go back to that discussion before. When it comes to nuclear, it's very interesting. I often say that if nuclear energy would be invented today, if it was discovered, like we have this new energy source, it's called nuclear energy, I think it would be very, very much the solution to climate change. I think it would be no discussion at all that nuclear is the way we are solving climate change. And I think there would be universal agreement about that. But nuclear energy comes with a very long shadow of the Cold War and a very masculine kind of worldview, and all there are problems, psychological problems related to nuclear, and also a problem with the kind of social license of this technology. That it's not so much that it's technological. When I started, I used to be a campaigner against nuclear, and now I find myself almost being a campaigner for nuclear. But I also realized it's a very, very problematic solution to climate change and many other issues, because it's very brittle. Psychologically, it's one of those issues where if you have one accident, even like Fukushima, with almost no people dying from radiation, or there's maybe one case possibly, and even as I traveled to Chernobyl, I've been to both Chernobyl and Fukushima, and both these places persuaded me about the soundness of the technology in a way that in the worst case scenario, this is what happens. Whereas when you travel and you see many other energy sources, we use very different standards when we think of hydro dams collapsing or so. But there is something psychological, which is very, very hard to grasp when it comes to nuclear and how it has been framed in the debate. So I am very worried also that if we would use nuclear, especially existing nuclear technologies, there would be a risk for a very strong backlash, if there would be an accident, for instance. So nuclear is kind of this magic technology, and also when you think about next generation nuclear that can recycle existing waste and so forth, it has all these properties and characteristics that makes it very, very good as a solution to climate change. But psychologically and social, I'm less convinced, and I often meet these super pro-nuclear people, and I say this is partly a problem of like science communication, but it's also a broader. It's how we think about ourselves and what we think is natural and what we think is artificial, and it fits in a very. It's very difficult to really sort of see nuclear playing the role that it theoretically and technologically could do in a time frame that is relevant. So this has me a little, I shouldn't say I'm disillusioned, because I'm very optimistic about many things. And I mean, unless we do really crazy things in this world, which we might do, who knows? But unless we do these crazy things like start nuclear wars and stuff, I think we can generally do, we will manage with climate change eventually. But the question is, who are we? And it's very uneven. I mean, in Sweden, we will survive climate change. I think that if you look about it. But looking globally, it will make it much harder for, particularly in the tropics generally, to have broad economic development. It will have very, very big impact on biodiversity. It will have very, very big environmental impact generally. That will be very hard to reverse with melting Arctic and melting polar ice generally. And all this is very, very problematic, I think, if we are concerned about nature. So what I'm seeing is that we'll probably need to reorient climate policy at some point, because I'm not seeing, I mean, when I meet climate skeptics, people who don't believe in climate change, I say, I really hope you're right. I seriously hope you're right, because if you're right, then there wouldn't be a problem. It would be wonderful if you're right. So don't take it like that. But the science does not suggest, from what we know, the science does not suggest that climate change is just some wicked idea that someone came up with, the 60s, some hippie. Climate change is very, very real and something that will affect our lives, and is already affecting the planet in a multitude of ways. It's not the only problem in the world, and I think it is important to keep that in mind, and I think maybe the pandemic helped a little bit in situating made us realize on one hand that we are extremely globalized, we have so much in common now, but we're also seeing resurgent nationalism, resurgent like localism in different ways that I think make it very hard to solve problems like my country first, no matter what. So many of the things we have seen here in climate is you can also see in some ways in the pandemic in response. Now when I think it's like reality always is. Reality is messy. But where I'm seeing, if you look ahead, I think that Scandinavian leadership is maybe true in environmental in some areas when it comes to biking. Like I still don't own a car. I love biking. I love having this building these urban environments that are more conducive to walking and other forms of mobility. And I think those things are very encouraging, those signs, and there are many people who want to get away from traditional, in a way, development. But on the other hand, I also see that Scandinavian leadership is very self-righteous, not as bad as Germany, but still we are very, very focused on thinking that we are doing the right thing, rather than looking at the broader picture about what this means. And of course, this is very problematic if we, for instance, in different multilateral organizations, for instance, say to developing countries that you cannot borrow money to build nuclear, you cannot borrow money to build fossil fuels, you can only borrow money to build renewables. But in our own societies, we are still very fossil, we still use nuclear, we use all the things, we have this double standard. And that kind of thinking is, I think, very common in agriculture and many other policy areas, that there are two different norms, and there's always this norm explosion to other export to other countries, like you should become avoid our mistakes in a way. And that is, I think, hypocrisy, and that is a very, very big issue, broader in how we relate to the world. So that is about, just to finish up, because I really want to hear what you guys have, questions you have, but to just finish up these 3 slides, I wanted to say something about that there is, you might have heard, there's a lot of hype, and I saw also in relation to India here with the hydrogen, very much focused now on green hydrogen. Again, it's important to remember, I mean, hydrogen is an energy carrier, it's not energy source. So depending on how you get the energy, if you get the energy in that massive amount from nuclear or something, then you can imagine it being possible to produce. But when you get into renewables, you have a very big problem of energy sprawl. If you look at how are you going to have, I mean, you can just own a calculator and you sit down and calculate, like, how do you power India with wind power? You realize this is not possible. It's like the energy forestry. Like, if you look at the numbers, you need other land uses, you see this is not going to work. And you don't have to be particularly smart actually to realize that many of these issues have to do with density. If you have 1.1 or in China's case 1.3 billion people in a country, you cannot have the same solutions as in a country where you have massive amount of forest and massive amount of space for these things. It's a completely different picture, right? So and I think generally this is just a little setting. Then I have to say something about SRM as the last thing, because I don't know if you've heard this term, but it's an interesting development in this course, how it changed, because unless we do something about emissions, which I really hope we will, to the extent needed, and also have negative emissions for a sustained period of time, there will be substantial warming, and that will be particularly problematic in the tropics, where you will have very, very high temperatures, and you already have these extreme heat waves, for instance, and also forest fires. But also in the Arctic, of course, with the melting polar ice. And this might lead to more and more experiments in the realm of solar radiation management and how to reduce the amount of sunlight that gets into the atmosphere. And this is like science fiction. It seemed like only a couple of decades ago, but it's a maturing discourse. And I think that when we see the emergency of climate change becoming real, then I think there will be solutions in a way that are that will become necessary. In the same way as if you have cancer, you might go to have chemotherapy, even if chemotherapy is no good for your health. But the alternative to dying cancer is really much worse. And that kind of thinking, I think, will also come into play when it comes to climate. And I don't say that is a good thing. I just say that that's probably where we will end up, at least for some time, when it comes to controlling the global environment. So that was a lot of things. And maybe this is a little far off, for it's quite technical, much of this. But I just wanted to get you some thoughts about how I have been thinking, and I think my publications are much better than the Zoom version, but that's just like giving you a little image. I see there's a lot of discussion in the chat, but you said you had moderation, so maybe we should do some. Oh, that's a lot of questions here. So I think I'm happy now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Karlsson, for an illuminating session. Before we move on to questions, I'd like to hand over the mic to Professor Bhaswati Sarkar to address the speaker in the session once. Okay. Ma'am?
Yeah, I'm not on mute, no?
No.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you, Professor Rasmus. I think it was a very, what should I say? It brought out so many things on the question of climate change and environment. And we actually transited to this last session so smoothly that I didn't even have the time to welcome you on behalf of Center for European Studies and the Nordic Summer School. I really appreciate that you have taken out time and you're here with us, and you have given us a excellent kind of an exposure of what are the complexities of how do you deal with this. I think that came out very strongly in your presentation, because you're talking about scalability. And you very clearly say that what we have done in Sweden or in the Nordics per se cannot, you cannot think of doing it in India or China. You're talking about decarbonizing, and I think you're talking about decarbonizing globally. That's something you brought out. So there are many issues which you flagged, and somehow they were more as posers, in the sense that there are these problems and we don't know really how to get around them. And I think at the same time, we need to also focus on India, because in the sense that when we had the inaugural session, one of the ambassadors very clearly said that if you're looking at the SDGs And if India is not on board, and that is why the Nordic countries are looking at India very closely and its green initiative and how to, sort of help out India in its various programs, keeping this green initiative in focus. Because unless India succeeds, the goals will not succeed. So I think that is something which is very critical. And thank you once again. There are very many questions, and I'm sure you will have a good time answering them.
Thank you, ma'am. So we are roughly 15 minutes, and just picking up from the issues that ma'am flagged. We do have a question on India. It's by Neha. She said that she's asking, what is the Nordic position on the role of developing countries like India? What is the position on the role that developing countries like India are willing to play in combating climate change?
I think that policy-wise, I mean, there we have the European Union, of course, being one big actor in external affairs, and it's also, I think in general, Sweden, I mean, this is part also, I mean, this could be going forever and ever and ever, but it's like the projectification or the way, let's say, development aid has changed to, in light of results-based management and all this kind of thinking that has moved away from, if you look at how Sweden transitioned from agricultural poverty, we had starvation in the 1860s, like big scale starvation in Sweden. When we look back historically, how Sweden transitioned to modernity, this was a very, very painful process for urbanization. And it was not, like it's often presented, like we have always been rich, blah, blah, but that's really not the case. We were an agrarian country with very few people compared to like continental Europe. So in that sense, the history of Swedish development was very painful. And if you look today at development initiatives, they are very much focused on, oh, let's keep a small village, put up a solar lantern, or let's have make sustainable livelihoods or something. And this is very cute and all, but it's not the kind of transformative change that made our journey into a welfare state possible. And if someone would have come to Sweden in the 1850s and given out money, or let's keep your little forest here and live here and you can have your coca beans or whatnot, that's kind of, it's just like, it is a very patronizing worldview. And I mean, I don't say Scandinavia does a lot of good things, and we are a lot of great products in many, many areas with regards to a lot of things like gender issues, and there are tons of big good things that Scandinavian Development Aid does. But when you look at a broader picture, especially this romanticization of the third world, that people should live in small huts and be cute, and we can go as tourists there, but they should not go to Starbucks. And that kind of, it's kind of a different moral standing. And this, India is of course, as a rapidly developing country on its own terms, it is not the same as how we behave in Africa, for instance, where we have a lot more of that romanticization. So, and how we in general treat, you can go to any Swedish store and you buy coffee beans, and you get a story about now they can live in a village and they can grow their coffee and sustainable coffee practices and blah, blah, blah. And it's an assumption that those people are generally very different from us. They are not like us. They don't aspire for our things. We can go there as tourists, but they should not become us. And that is like a basic assumption. And I think that is a fundamental flaw in how we think development aid. But it's very, very hard to change, because most of the people who go into development aid issues are having a very, I think, I'm personally a social democrat, so when I say this, it will sound very strange, but I think they often have a very anti-capitalist worldview. So for them, it's horrible to think that people should live like they do themselves. So in that way, you get this discrepancy also on a personal level. That's more of a rant maybe than an answer, but generally speaking, I think that Scandinavia, I mean, we have in many specific areas, I think we have also a lot of technological knowledge that is very useful in how we moving now to fossil-free steel. And there's a lot of specific areas, and also generally when you look at process technology in so many areas, there's a lot industries, process industries, there's a lot of things going on that are very useful. And I think we can also contribute with good knowledge. But I also think that there's a fundamental deeper problem with how we imagine development in the world that is very problematic.
Thank you for that interesting answer. So we have a couple of questions on the sharing of green technology. Rajiv is asking, can you explain the Nordic approach towards the transfer of green technology to developing countries? And Nikhil is asking, why do Nordic countries have a general inhibition in sharing environmental friendly technologies? Why is the approach towards monopolizing environmental leadership? Why do Nordic countries are generally inhibiting in transferring technology?
That last part is a little tricky. I mean, it's interesting, if you go back 10 years or so or more, 15 years, you had a very strong focus on the clean development mechanism. And there are projects actually in Delhi, the subway is a CD, it's one of the few clean development mechanism projects in infrastructure at the time. It was built partly through CDM funding. CDM has become, it's become this kind of rogue universe with all these questions about financing. And now, of course, with climate fund and all this big issues, it's a very let's say, if you want to use a funny word, it's a very dynamic landscape of climate financing. And I think that I don't think that how should I say this? I think that as long as you're inside the renewable energy universe, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm of sharing technology, and there's a lot of enthusiasm because it's not so. It's very much seen as like even in on a discourse level, like you cannot say things like renewable is not sustainable, for instance. That language doesn't allow you to say those things, so it sort of conditions your mind a lot. And if you're into the renewable energy universe, I think Sweden is doing, and other European countries are very, very keen on selling. Denmark in particular, wind power, has always seen this as a way also of building an industry. That's the whole point of transitioning to renewables for many countries like Denmark, was also to export it to the world, so they could have a strong industrial base. So that is really, I think, has been always on their agenda, to sell things to other people. But that is clearly not the case with regard to, for instance, nuclear innovation, where you have a lot more, it's much more politicized. And also Sweden is very, which has surprised me a lot, because the more I learn about the nuclear universe, I always also understand that, for instance, the United States is very, there's a lot of concerns about proliferation. Even the countries that have nuclear weapons, such as India, there's a lot of concern about these issues in terms of technological transfer and what can be done. And so there's, I would say that is more areas where it's much stricter when it comes to how we, in the political terms, what we allow or want to export. So, because it's only basically Russia today that is like the key seller of nuclear things to other people, and Korea to some extent. But Russia is really the country that sort of pushed this technology on other countries in terms of that they operate often the facilities and sell it like a package. So it's an interesting difference there. But generally, green technology, if you think of it as renewable, then there's a lot of enthusiasm that India and China will be the mass markets, for instance. That's, I think, what they imagine, a lot of people.
Thank you. The next question is by Adya. She's asking, in what ways does the Nordic environmental leadership differ from that of Germany and France?
France is a funny case, because they have one. If you look at emissions, like as I said, they have a very big nuclear industry, and they are very, very green electricity. But no one in France knows this. Very few people in France know this. If you talk to people, they are very unaware. France is very reluctant, has been historically unwilling in a way. It's a paradox in a way. They are not so willing to talk about this or go to the IPCC. If you look at IPCC authors, there's a very, very strong, has a lot of Germans who are funded by the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs to promote German views and German perspectives. So Germany has seen this as an opportunity with the German energy transition, whereas France has not. And there's more like, I think Germany is the country that also pushes this a lot to its neighbors in Europe, like you have to go renewable, otherwise we will hate you. And you have all these sanction systems and all this kind of mindset. So in that way, it's been interesting now with Poland suggesting building nuclear, and you have a strong backlash from Germany. But globally, I say that Germany is again one of the biggest exporters of this of renewable energy transition thinking, and also through IPCC have been able to sort of solidify that as a kind of scientific worldview, which is very interesting in a way. But Scandinavia, I think, is less pronounced. It's been more pragmatic, especially Finland is extremely pragmatic. It's a kind of a very odd, in a way, case in the Finland is building nuclear quite a lot now. They also have more coal than we have. We don't have coal, but they have a lot for house, for residential heating and stuff. They have a quite high fossil use still, but they are moving into nuclear more. And it's an interesting case in the way that there's very little debate about this in Finland. It's more de facto that they are pragmatic and rational in the way the discourse is, where I shouldn't make much of national stereotypes, but there is a kind of stereotypical element to that. It's more a technical pragmatic issue than a political one in the way it's hyper politicized in Germany. I live in Germany, and I think this issue is similar to abortion almost. If you go to Germany and you talk about energy and climate, it's a bit like going to the Midwest in America and the US and talk about abortion. It's like a very, very strong political issue. And people go crazy about these issues. It's not like they can discuss it. It's way beyond that. And that's not the case in Finland, for instance. So you have a very strong difference there between countries. Okay.
All right, thank you. So the next question is by Ishita. She says that given that the impact of climate change is not distributed equally, I want to know how the Nordic climate policy tries to address this gap, and what solution does it try to provide as a climate leader, if at all?
This is probably a little bit what I talked about. I mean, it's so strange in a way, because when you look into the future, I mean, there is this talk about climate refugees. There's this, oh, if we don't do anything, there will be a lot of people coming here that would be very bad for us or something, that kind of thinking. But there is, I don't see it as a forward-looking vision at all. It's as, again, that's what I'm trying to do in my research, to try to ask those very difficult questions. And I hope you don't all become depressed and jump out of the window today, because that's not my point. I really think I am an optimist strongly about these things. It's just that it's a very, we have never done this. We have never tried to build a planetary civilization with 8 billion people. Of course, it takes time to learn, and it's complicated, and it's messy, and it's the way life always been. And I mean, there's always this conflicted perspectives and so. And I think it's important to remember that climate change, it's not surprising that something like this would happen. Eventually we'll come across a problem like this would appear, and it might take many decades until we find a good way of dealing with it. And I mean, I watched too much Star Trek as a kid, and I am an optimist. I believe strongly that if you look back 500 years from now, we will be happy about this and say, well, we fixed it. But it's a question in what ways and for whom, and the distributional impacts, and who is going to pay the price. And that's where the picture is more conflicted. And I think we can do it in better and worse ways. And right now I'm afraid we're doing a few things that might not be so helpful in the long run, but maybe we have to do them first. That's what I often say about this, but maybe we have to try in a way, for instance, with renewable energy and solar energy, because it has such a psychological role to play for people to, because if we would say we stop solar, we only build nuclear tomorrow, that might solve the problem, but people will always say, look, we were one day away from fixing it. We were almost there, but then these evil people. So I don't think that it's possible to think like that. I think it's something have to be done first to see its limitations, and then we learn and we adapt. That's how often change happens. It's not like masterminding doesn't really work, but I think it is important to have this discussion, and especially distribution, and thinking about how can we make it possible, for instance, for India to continue to develop and really build a better society without having a large climate impact. And I think many people, when I've been to Delhi, like it's clear from the air pollution factor, from so many reasons, that people, they don't want that kind of development. There is a limit to it, but there is also, of course, real concerns about poverty and where we're coming from. And I think it's not so simple. It's easy to be in Sweden and talk about all these things when you don't have, the stakes are not the same, simply. And time is out, I figured.
Thank you so much for such an engaging session.
Thank
Before
you.
we end formally, I would like to invite Ms. Christabel from the Nordic Center India to formally thank you.
Oh,
Thank you, Professor Karlsson. Thank you for spending your time with us. Thank you for such a thought-provoking lecture today. And thank you for such an energetic lecture. I think it's the last day, it's the last lecture for the day, and it's already quite late in India. And we needed your energy to get back into the mood of the summer school. So thank you very much. I also would like to thank, yes, sorry, please go ahead.
No, so I say it's summer here. We got a little sunshine suddenly. Sorry if the picture gets very sunny, but we have long, it's beautiful in this time of year in the Nordics, because we get up here in the north, we have almost no night left soon. We are going into midnight sun, so it's beautiful. So,
you're stepping into spring now, and thank you very much. And you brought that spring to us as well at 8, nearly it's going to be quite late for us in India today. Thank you very much once again. And thank you to all the participants from NCI, from JNU, Center European Studies, Bhaswati, Professor Sarkar and her team. Thank you all for a fantastic conclusion, of day 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
So I end the meeting, and tomorrow we meet again at 5:30.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you.